Welcome to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writer Center. I'm also a fiction writer. I publish a story collection and a novel as well. So that is why I am at least partially qualified to have this conversation today. And Cleo, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm really excited to talk about this book. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me and for gushing.
Yeah. So first, do you have your book handy? Could you just
Yeah.
give us an excerpt, just a brief excerpt, so we have an idea of what we're going to be talking about?
Yes. So I think I was dithering over what to read, but I think I'm going to just read from the first story, the first few pages. So this is the story called Chicken Film Youth, and it's the first story in the collection. It was hard to articulate the point at which we switched from wanting to get older to feeling like we could stand to be a little bit younger. Perhaps there had never been a point when we really felt like we wanted to be older, only to have the things we thought being older entailed: freedom, money, privacy, love. But it had always been true that if we were a little bit younger, a little bit fresher, then we'd be a little bit better. It was raining in LA, a slurry of wet in a city never designed for it. Water poured down from rooftops and pooled in inconvenient potholes. Aggressive Porsche 718s and equally aggressive Honda CR-Vs competed on right turns, raising miniature tsunamis over the sidewalks. Sitting by the windows of Mr. King's chicken restaurant, we watched the rain drizzle over the billboards and blinking lights advertising the other stores in the strip mall. The Thai restaurant, the shaved ice cafe, the boba and crepe shop, the tofu house, and the aspirational artisanal grocery store with the $26 charcuterie plates. The rain made the strip mall look muted, pretty, the neon lights taking on a fairy tale aura as they blurred through the pane. Half and half spicy sauce and soy garlic, Mr. Kang called out. Grab some radish too, Dake reminded me as I pushed my chair back. When I put the tray on the table, he said, "This chicken looks amazing." The fried chicken, unveiled from its styrofoam lid, glistened with a honeyed texture. Underneath its sprinkling of white sesame seeds, the skin of the chicken pieces beckoned with its coy, crisp, perfectly golden color. In an unusual move that had given this restaurant its write-up in the Times, the chicken was layered with a hearty handful of cut fruit: avocado, raspberries, blueberries, and a few slices of jalapeno. When we bit in, the meat was warm, moist, and tender. Eileen mmmmed. The glazed fruit added a startlingly light contrast to the meat. Jessica sucked on her iced water. The rest of us all had beers. Jessica was a killjoy who cared about calories. And something about how alcohol caused skin aging? When she was a kid, she had entered into beauty pageants. She wore little tiaras, had skin so bright and glowing it was like her face was a spotlight. Now she was still pretty, but she wasn't a pageant winner. She was a dental hygienist. She wore fuzzy cardigans and circle lenses. Every year, she spent hundreds, if not thousands, on skincare, makeup, and lash extensions to keep her 3,000 Instagram followers and trickle of occasionally fraudulent sponsorship offers. But hey, what else could she do? She was no longer 22. She was 28. We were all 28, or just about to turn 29. There were four of us: Dake, Jessica, Eileen, and me. Dake and I were high school friends. We met in LA, or more precisely, Long Beach, where we went to the California Institute of Mathematics and Science, which is a magnet school for cutthroat bitches and overachievers. It's the kind of place where if you aren't already taking college-level calculus when you're in 8th grade, you're behind. When I transferred in, Dake and I bonded over our mutual relative inferiority. Senior prom, there had been a let's go as friends date, an awkward kiss, emotional fallout, and then we stopped speaking. Until the summer he was interning at Snapchat, I was interning at the LA Department of Cultural Affairs. We got lunch and things were okay again. Sometimes I look at him and wonder a little what we would be like together, but for the most part, I leave it alone. "Luna, tell me about you and Billy," Eileen said. "God, I can't believe you're dating someone named Billy." Dake's sardonic tone made me bristle with a slight frisson of irritation. I know, I said, trying to shrug it off. Billy was new. I'd run into him in a Trader Joe's. My cart had stiff wheels. He had 2 towering stacks of canned San Marzano tomatoes and cannelli beans in his arms. An accidental nudge, and they all came tumbling down. One can bounced off the naked toenail of my big toe. I'm so sorry, I gasped as my toe throbbed. I'm so sorry, he gasped. He ran to find an employee to get a band-aid for the toe, and there were no other injuries. Has it been awkward, dating white? Eileen probed. It's been okay so far, but there are some moments where I'm like, oh, you don't come from the same place I do. Like when we got mochi ice cream and he didn't eat the mochi skin. He took it off and just ate the ice cream. I was Billy's second Asian girlfriend, but he had dated a couple of white girls and one Latinx girl and didn't watch anime, so I was fairly confident he didn't have yellow fever. Aside from one ill-begotten crush on a white boy named Andrew in high school, my exes, including Kevin, a chemistry major now turned Twitch streamer from college, Aaron, a photographer I'd met in New York, and Minji, the on-again, off-again DJ ex-girlfriend I'd been entangled with in LA, had all been of East Asian ancestry. That could be you being classist, Jessica pointed out, annoyingly. Mochi ice cream is kind of bougie. I guess that's true, I tried to concede. It was fun to be in a relationship again, to have someone around to watch TV and do shrooms with while laughing at the dumb things people on reality shows said. With Billy, I felt safe, even a little bored. There were nights when I forgot to think about him. There were nights when, sitting next to him, I sensed that in 1 year, 2 years, even 4 years, I might wake up and find that all that time had passed, and I was still with him, and that would not be the worst thing. This feeling terrified me. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Everyone, again, please, if you're able to get a copy of the book, that's the best way to support authors and writers. If you can't get it from your local indie, if you have a local independent bookseller, you can go to the bookshop.org link we'll put in the chat window or we put in earlier. And you can also ask your library to get it if you can't afford to buy a book right now. So please support the books. So in your own words, Cleo, who the heck are you?
My name is Cleo, she, her. I am a writer originally from Southern California. Since then, I've lived in several places, including China, Japan, New York, and Chicago, and I now split my time between New York and Chicago.
Thank you. So the first question we ask is sometimes the hardest. Some authors really hate it, and if you're one of those, I'm sorry, but I'm going to ask it anyway and just risk it. So what's a question you really wish someone would ask about your writing or writing practice? In other words, what haven't you gotten to speak about before or yet on this book tour, maybe?
One thing I have not been able to talk about so far is the movies that have influenced me.
Ooh.
Should I
Okay.
talk about them?
Yes, please. What movies? I'm fascinated about influences that authors have outside of writing influences.
Yeah, so one of the movies that I feel like when I watched it, it really kind of like shaped me as a writer and also shaped how I thought about this collection is Perfect Blue by Satoshi Kon, which has a very blue palette, and you'll notice that my book cover is also blue, which is something I really pushed for. And so Perfect Blue is an animated movie, which a lot of later movies like borrowed from in terms of like camera angles and things like that. Like for example, like it was a big influence on Black Swan, and so it's kind of like, not to give anything away, but it's about like a pop idol who kind of like starts trying to audition to be an actress, and she's doing this in the early days of the internet, and so there's a lot about internet. There's a lot about like the fragmentation of her personality, about the feeling of like what it's like to be on the internet, to be observed, like identity through the internet, things like that, and also like a feeling of psychological horror as she's like a very vulnerable young woman who is being stalked by someone throughout the movie, or seems like it. And so that feeling of fear is also something that I wrote about that in my stories as well.
Yeah, I was so I'm going to ad lib here a little bit because I had jotted some notes like a while ago when I like first read the stories, and one thing I noticed was nested elements in a lot of the stories. The animation in Monitor World, the game Hakuoki in Zeros Ones, and the Alchemy Lab in its own way, and the Power and Control. And I'm sure I'm missing some, but there's these places of isolation or separation or projection of self outside, which seems very related to what you just said, is why that popped up just now. But I feel like those stories could have theoretically not had the nested elements. Like you could have told the story without the nested element. Not saying you would want to, because I think that would be a terrible idea. The nested elements are great. But what do you see those nested? I mean, are those nested elements related to that kind of concept you just talked about? Or what were you thinking when those elements came in as like components against which the real world, quote unquote, action of the story is taking place?
Yeah, that is an interesting observation. And it's interesting to have a book out in the world and to have someone read the stories and be like, look at all these things you do in common. When I think, when, obviously, Zach, you know, as a writer yourself, like when you're in the actual process, you don't think about it quite that consciously. But I do think that I like having a space in the story that is not the physical world per se. Because part of what I think in my generation, especially, and in Gen Z, is that so much of our lives happen on screen and it feels kind of cut off from the physical world. But how do you represent that in fiction and make it seem like it's, you know, the emotional stuff that happens there, the psychological stuff that happens on the internet and in the screens? How do you make that feel as urgent and as real as what's taking place in the physical world? And sometimes, like, when we're living our lives, the lives that we have on screen are even more intense than the lives we have in the physical worlds. So I think um that is something that I consciously kind of like, well, not consciously, that is something that was a big driving force as I was structuring these stories.
Right. And you had a couple dittos for Perfect Blue from people in the comments there. So I've never seen it, which I'm now really ashamed to say, because I feel I'm pretty cultured in the way of these things, but apparently not. So I jotted it down to add to my list. So the first thing I planned to talk about was surreality in these stories. They sort of occupy a fascinating spot for me because whether or not they're in a realistic setting, there's a decentering of sort of the everyday reality that is pushing me into a surrealistic mode, even if like the content isn't purely surrealistic in like the Dali sense of weird things in a painting. It's reality that's strange, made a little bit strange, just enough to decenter me and make me pay attention in a different way. And I love that so much. So that's one of the reasons I'm gushing about the book. Um, what do you think the difference is between reality, like real world reality, and reality within fiction, and how are you maybe playing with that in your stories?
Well, I think the real world is sometimes very hard to understand, but also can be, you know, so prosaic and so known to us. And in the space of fiction, as in the space of other narrative vehicles such as TV or film, for example, like the creator has tools to make reality seem more interesting. So like, you know, in a film, that might be the way that they like color grade or like, you know, like frame certain shots. And in fiction, it's the description, the depiction of like psychological realities or like using words and language to make things a little bit off center, as you said, or uncanny, or to make the reader look at the world in a different way. And I think so much of that is sort of like incumbent upon the author's observations as a person. And I know that I often find the world extremely inexplicable and strange, because I mean, I've been told I have very little common sense, or like, you know, I'm not very practical, et cetera, et cetera. And I think like that probably creeps into like, I'm someone who knocks against the world a lot. I find living in this world to be full of friction. And so that probably comes out in my fiction.
Yeah. So I also feel like there's the right things are included, but there's also I feel like you've done really well leaving space in the story. Like there's the density of the story is right to allow the slippage, if that makes sense. How do you how do these stories come out in like first drafts sort of in this way, or these stories that you maybe edit to thin them as you edit them? They get thicker as you edit them with more density of material? Do they thin out as you edit them to achieve an effect? How do they sort of evolve from ideation through publication?
Yeah, each story is different. I definitely think that they tend to thicken with the drafts, as you might say. And by thicken, I do mean like I compress more into a shorter space. So on the one hand, I think that a short story, you can do some things that it's harder to pull off in a longer form, like a novel, because the reader's suspension of disbelief lasts for a shorter period of time. Um, but also, like, you know, I try to be very conscientious to the reader by being like, you know, everyone I know who likes to read, or, you know, everyone's kind of like, well, things are too long these days. And I'm kind of like, yes, like let's all try to give people like, you know, shorter things to read. And so whenever I'm editing, I really try to cut things down. And I think um an example of that is Seagull Village, which is the last story in the book. And in the first draft of that story, it was, you know, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 words. It was quite longish. And I was so attached to a lot of like the description I had written to like, various turns of phrase I thought were like quite neat. And I was like, oh, like everything's perfect. Like it's a great story. But then over the years as I kept editing it and editing it, it got whittled down to 5,000 words, which is, a pretty significant cut. And I really do feel like nothing was lost. And the more I whittled, like, no major plot points were lost, no major characters were lost, like no major dialogue was lost. It's just like as I whittled down, like the story got like denser and denser and like each word pulled more weight. So I think that's something I
Do
think
you,
about.
do you ever find yourself going too far in that process and pulling back and like, whoa, 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 I've gotten too happy with the pruning shears. I need to leave something in, or are you just relentless all the way to the end?
I'm pretty relentless. I don't think I've ever been like I should put something back.
I don't even save things I cut usually, so I'm team relentless for sure. Another thing that I liked about these stories a lot is the sense of forward motion. I like it here because I don't think, and you can disagree with me, because just in my readings, I didn't see the story arc in like, I didn't see the bold stroke of the story arc going through these stories. And I mean that in a really, really good way. There's forward motion, there's character change, there's some of the things we're looking for that relate to the story arc, but I didn't see that guiding principle in a way. And I love it when stories achieve forward motion without really the obviousness of the architecture asserting itself. So how do you think about moving a reader forward through your stories, especially if you're less concerned with an arc or some other formal element that may be some structural element, some structural metaphor?
Yeah, that was also an interesting question to receive because I do think that when people start out writing fiction, they get taught some basics, right? Like, like the 3-act structure or the 5-act structure and character arcs and things like that. And I do think that I don't really follow that in these stories, though each story is different. Like I do think that some of the stories, like Wing and the Radio, there is more of a traditional kind of like plot arc and character arc, but a lot of them are not like that. And one thing is, I do think that the story arc that we're taught in workshop is a very, Western centric, English literature, tradition centric construct. And I read a lot across non-English language authors in translation. So I like to read, Spanish language authors. I like to read people translated from Mandarin or Japanese or Korean. I love to read people translated like Europa editions that does like, all those like translated books. I love them. I'm always like fangirling over them. And so I feel like I learn a lot about alternatives to the Western character arc or three-act structure by reading across the world. And there's especially a craft book I wanted to recommend to people called Meander, Spiral, Explode, which I cannot remember the author, forgive me, but that has a lot of different plot structures that people can follow, which I thought was really, for me, liberating to be like, you know what, like we don't like a lot of the things I love to read that feel the most surprising to me are the ones that don't follow that traditional arc or 3-act structure. And this craft book kind of like made explicit like why those structures work and why they're interesting.
Jane Allison.
Thank you.
I happen to have it I happen to have that written down another window so I could glance real quick, and I just put it in the chat window for anyone who's interested in. It's a great book. Are there any other books that just in terms of recommendations, are there any fiction books that you jump out right away as ones that you'd say, hey, read this to get an idea of what I'm talking about? Putting you on the spot.
Well, The Lover by Margaret Duras is one that Jane Allison cites. And, that book is really told in fragments. It's so psychologically intense and compressed. I feel like another writer that, especially when I was younger, who I was much influenced by was Patrick Modiano, who, his novels have a lot of like somebody like walking around Paris and there's like a missing woman and there's like a mood of nostalgia. And it's hard to say exactly like what drives the reader from the beginning to the end of those novels because there's not exactly a lot of action or a lot of like plot resolution and things for conflict, but like the mood really keeps you going. And so I feel like, when I read him, I was really like, mood is something that can just keep someone reading.
So we do have a first question in the chat window I'm going to pull up because I think it's related to our previous question, which is, I would like to know how you prefer characters or words or motion. And I assume just how you prefer to interact, each of them to function.
Um, I think that, oh, someone said, what were the books just recommended, please? One of them was The Lover by Margaret Duras. I don't know if I'm saying that name right. And the second one was the French author Patrick Modiano. Um,
Try to find it
um,
while you answer the question.
as for the other questions, yeah, I don't think of myself as a like language driven author particularly, you know. Um, I'm sure I could learn a lot from, you know, other poets and stuff, as you said, Zach. I think I'm very much a mood person, so I definitely go into stories with the feeling of like, what is the mood I want to convey? Is it like a creepy mood? Is it like a nostalgic mood? Is it like a uh you know, envious mood? Like that first story that I read an excerpt from, there's a lot of like, you know, kind of like self-comparison going on between like a group of peers and stuff. So those are, so I often think about the mood that I want to convey in the story first and foremost, versus anything else.
So you mentioned mood, and that's really interesting to me because one of the thing, mood and emotion you mentioned there, and another one of my early notes, which I found after I'd sent you my questions, was there are a lot of artificial connections similar to the, you know, artificial and or virtual connections through dating apps, through games, through whatever. There are a few imagined connections, and there are a few non-connections with people failing to meet in a real meaningful way. And lack of connection it leads us almost to like this existential space where the emotions are not the emotions are subtler in a way because they're almost like paired with regret or paired with lack. And I'm wondering how you sort of tackle emotions, especially in those situations where the connections are less substantial than face-to-face love at first sight moments or things like that that we're a little more familiar with from our movie vocabulary, at least, if not our literary vocabulary.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, in the space of virtual relationships, and I see this a lot with like, you know, like I'm 29 right now, and like, you know, people my age and younger, like the way that we the way that we place so much expectation on virtual relationships or parasocial relationships, like, you know, there's so many people who feel like, for example, if there's a YouTube influencer or like, you know, a Twitch streamer that they really like, they will feel like they know that person. They will feel kind of like entitled to like get updates from them and to like be connected to them. And also obviously like, you know, Instagram and celebrities on Instagram who fans interact with, but also just like in the space of apps and like connections on like, let's say Hinge or LinkedIn or whatever. Like there is a sense of like no one really knows what the right etiquette is, and no one knows how they should feel. Like if someone like if you've been talking to someone on like an app for like 3 days and they stop replying, like was that a real connection? Like should you feel disappointed, or like is that just kind of like you shouldn't get that invested because it was just like somebody on a screen like typing something out? I think those are questions that really permeate people my age, and so those do come up in the stories a lot, but I don't really know if I answer them. Like I think the emotions are just there.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I the emotions are there, but I also, I mean, I don't think they need a direct explanation. It's almost like a thing I admire about the way the stories work is that they are functioning against maybe just expectation, you know, traditional Western fiction expectation in terms of like these emotions are sitting they're sitting off center. They're not like necessarily always right here in the heart. They're like sometimes in the palm of your hand. You're being inspected in a kind of a weird way, and it's really interesting to me to read those, and I appreciate that a lot. Just again, anyone who has questions at any point, please put them in the chat window. We're happy to take your questions rather than mine. So another question for me in the meantime is I want to talk about the endings of the stories because I really love your ability to end something in an interesting way. There's sort of an open anti-pat. That was the phrase, or anti-pat. It's like the opposite of pat ending sometimes. Instead of conclusions, they almost function openings into wonder. I also put that in italics because I was apparently proud of my phrase when I wrote that, but they open into wonder. They are less resolution and more, hey, keep living on this world in your head a little bit. And they're invitations almost, which is really interesting to me. So how do you conceive of endings yourself? And if it isn't like this nice little pat moment where everything resolves and comes together, how do you know when a story is complete?
Yeah, and actually, before I answer that, I did want to ask you, Zach, like, do you as a writer feel like you like resolution when you like you
Oh
think
no, no, I'm Captain Anticlimax. So
yeah. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of pressure on like the conclusion or the climax in narratives, like in films or TV series or novels. Like there's a lot of pressure on sticking the landing, and often it's really hard to do. Like often the landing is not as satisfying as the question or the mystery that was opened up at the beginning of the series, um, or the novel or the short story. And I think that, so number one, I think that I like that feeling of abruptness at the end. I do think that some of my stories, one could say that like the ending is quite abrupt, but I like that kind of feeling of like you think you're driving somewhere and like you're on this road and then like suddenly there's like a cliff drop in front of you and you're just like, oh my God. And then like you're just left there. Um, and and I think that that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about like kind of like contemporary life or virtual connections, where often like there's a lot of unfinished questions, there's a lot of things in life that you never get closure on, people or questions, relationships that you never get closure on. So I think it's really true to life to not have a satisfying pat conclusion. um and as for when do I know if a story is complete or if like an ending is complete, I do feel like for most of my stories, yeah, I think for the vast majority of the ones in this collection, the ending never changed through the editing process. Like maybe a lot changed in the middle or like a lot changed like throughout, but actually I do feel like the ending was something that I always kind of like stuck to stuck to my guns and like knew I knew where I was headed when I started writing.
how when do you, so you know the ending's pretty early then? I mean, that's like, is the ending in sight from word one? I ask this because when I'm writing a story, I usually have a direction, then some point like, oh shit, this is where I'm going. Then I get excited, and then that's when I start writing a lot, because that's like suddenly the like almost like propelling the thing forward until it finds itself, and then it sort of knows where it's going. So I'm wondering how that process works for you.
Mm, definitely. I mean, I definitely don't know the whole thing when I start and sit down and write the story. But when I write the first draft, I think I am always looking to surprise myself. And so when I get to the ending of a story and I feel like I've successfully surprised myself, I'm like, oh, that was a surprise to me. And I like that feeling. And then I will stop there and I'll be like, how do I make the story that came before like better so that this ending, that it can live up to this ending, basically. Um, and so even though I don't always know the ending, like I feel like when I write the first draft, the ending is always the best part, and that's why I have to live up to it.
Nice. All right, so we had a few questions come in the chat window, so I'm going to turn there for a minute. Since you mentioned different non-book influences, are there things formally content-wise that you draw from other forms of art or any non-art things?
Hmm.
I love this question because I'm very much a non-writing influence person.
That's great. I would love to hear about some of those. I definitely try to be broad in what I consume content wise. So I do like to read nonfiction. I was in a science kick earlier this year, for example. Um, I am influenced by poetry. I think that, you know, I have also dabbled in poetry and written poetry in addition to fiction. And I read a lot of contemporary poetry, both in translation again and also in contemporary American poets. And I'm really interested by what poets do with form. And so I think that like seeing how poets are so open to just like arranging things on a page differently and how that might unlock something, or like how they might drop an image in or a metaphor in, but because it's a poem, they don't have to explain it. Like those are things that I also took into my fiction. And I feel like um, I also do think of the shape of my paragraphs sometimes. Like I do think of ways to break away from just the paragraph after paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, like structure of a normal story. So in some of the stories in my book, there are bullet points, there's ways in which I've like played with the white space a little bit and tried to break up like the regular sentence and paragraph flow.
That's great. I mean, I do everything from visual art to I studied music. So actually that one's kind of unconscious because I did that. That was the first part of my life. So I don't, it's ingrained. So I did realize though that like satisfying endings, for example, of a, whether it's a story or a paragraph or a sentence, it's like this combination of both when the syntax and the music both hit at the right way, and the music's sort of intuitive. Anyway, we're here to talk about you, so I'm done with that. I had another follow-up just about influences. Just I'm interested if about your influences in general. We covered a few of them, but are there any like really big influences on your writing? And really, maybe the question is, these stories in particular, are they what influenced them, and maybe what are they in conversation with? At least I feel like a lot of my writing, I'm sort of when I write a story, it's sort of a response to something that I've read in some way or another.
Yeah. So actually I do feel like I was really influenced by films, Perfect Blue being one example. Another one being it's called All About Lily Chocho by Shunji Iwai, another Japanese director. And that's another early internet film where there's a bunch of like youths in the Japanese like countryside, and they're obsessed with a singer named Lily Chocho, who's kind of like she's got kind of like a Lana Del Rey vibe. And they all go on this like very early internet chat forum and talk about how obsessed they are with her and how they want to go to this one concert that she's playing. But outside of this computer screen, where they are not anonymous and where they are all like going to school together, there's a lot of violence, a lot of anger, a lot of just like brutality and like misery. And they're all kind of like they're all like obsessed with Lily Shosho as kind of like a portal to transcend the kind of like the misery of their everyday teenage lives. So I think I was very influenced by movies about adolescence that show how depressing adolescence is, how brutal and violent it can be, and how much there is such a desire for sublimation, for escape, and how that kind of like breeds like obsession with something like, in my stories, there's like an obsession with like a K-pop idol, or like an obsession with like someone maybe you met once at like a party and never had a real relationship with, but like you project so much onto that person. Like I do think that is that my work is in conversation with those themes.
Going back to the chat window, this seems like a hard question, so we're gonna ask it. What do you think you'll be writing about when you're much older? How do you envision your future?
I don't know. It's a scary question. I hope to continue to write. It is scary because like a lot of the stories in this book are about like sort of like young adult concerns, or like like people in their 20s or middle 20s figuring things out, and there's so much like intensity of feeling as you're growing up and like figuring things out, and I do wonder how I will change as my life changes and I get older. Yeah.
So we'll come back. We'll have another craft chat in 10 and then 20 years, and we'll answer these questions with experience. In the chat window again, a question on your writing process. Most people are a little bit of both, but wondering if you're more of a planner, a plotter, outliner, or are you a let's see what comes out today type of person?
I'm very much a let's see what comes out today kind of person, and I wish I wasn't, but so here we are.
I mean, so where does the story come from then? I mean, do you literally just, I mean, what process do you sit down every day and just hope stuff comes? Or do you have like moments of, oh, this sounds interesting, I'm gonna write with this for a while and see what happens?
I have moments of like, this is interesting, I'm going to explore this for a while. Um, I do think that like regularly, kind not maybe not like every day, because all of us, like I don't want to pretend that I'm that kind of like person that writes every day or anything like that, but I do think that it's important to regularly like kind of like try to like tap into yourself and to your subconscious. And so I do journal a lot. I do a lot of like solo walks where I will do like self-reflection and like see where your like imagination catches. I think that like keeping yourself curious is really, really important. And so if I ever feel like I'm in a place in life or like a period of life where I'm feeling kind of bored by everything, like I will really go out and look for some kind of something to stimulate my curiosity, whether that's in a book or like in the outside world. And then I take all that back when I go write.
Yeah, great. Let's see. I've lost my place. So a next topic I was interested in was tone and voice. And we've hit on this a little bit, I think, in our discussion, but I guess my question, I sort of asked about the openness of it and the openness versus density, but I'm sort of broadly, what is your prose philosophy? How do you approach words on the page? What is you mentioned poetry as an influence, but what are you thinking in terms of writing prose? What is your philosophy of it? What if you had to distill that to something and share it with, say, a student in a workshop, what would you tell them?
I think that again, a word that I kind of keep coming back to is surprise is important. And so I think like for me, for example, like the word like verbs are quite important. So like in that excerpt I read earlier, like there's a line that's like Jessica sucked on her ice water. I feel like the word suck was something I kind of intentionally threw in there to like startle someone a little bit. Um, I think that I do really try to be considerate to the reader because I love reading and even I cannot like live forever reading something like Henry James or like, like those long, dense 19th century novels. Like we're not in that kind of like day and age anymore. And so whenever I'm writing, I really try to think like, what does a reader absolutely have to know? And so I think that my writing does kind of fluctuate between like there's sometimes a lot of detail and sometimes there isn't. And I try to make those choices very deliberate to be like, like how do I keep being efficient? I think efficiency is actually pretty important to me. And how do I maximize like my time with the reader to make sure that this image like sticks in their head the most and that they don't get cluttered with extraneous like self-indulgent little flourishes.
So no Henry James.
Wait, I mean like not to compare myself or anything, but, like like
Yes.
it's 2023, so
I can't. I've attempted Henry James and failed. So I'm a failure as an English person, or an English writer person type thing. So uh, you get no judgment from me. Though I love Moby Dick. Moby Dick is one of my favorite books. So I feel like he's a little more fun though. That's a fun factor.
I haven't gotten to Moby Dick yet.
I think Moby Dick is a postmodern masterpiece of a guy who really loves whales and whaling and is just having a really great time writing a book. I love it when he goes on a complete digression and explains whales for 12 pages. It's great. I want more whale explanations in contemporary novels. People who love the subject just so much they're going to stop and just tell you about it for a while. That's the kind of telling I want. That's when show don't tell is wrong. Tell me about whales. A couple questions came in the chat. First one, straightforward. What or who are you currently reading? Or I'll throw in, have recently read.
I just finished reading a novel translated from, I think, the Swedish, called Carnality by Lena Wolf, and that's with two F's. It was really weird. It took me on a ride I did not expect. And and then I also finished reading Bad Behavior by Mary Gaitskill for the first time, which is something that I've heard about for years and finally got around to reading, and it was really good.
Great. From the chat window, what are your thoughts on writing short fiction versus longer novel-length works? Is the decision to write published shorts more market-driven, or is it a preference for the form or something else?
Yeah, I will say that I don't feel like short stories are a market-driven form. It's so like yes, you can like publish them in a literary magazine, but like publishers just really want you to have a novel. And there was a lot of pressure in my MFA program and among all my fiction writing friends to like have a novel with the kind of like there is this like common unspoken knowledge that if you don't have one, you're like it's just so much harder to get a book out. And I had a novel, but it was just like really bad. And so I chose to not like I wrote a lot of these short stories alongside my like painstaking and ultimately fruitless labor of writing a novel for 5 years. And so I do think that what I've learned from that process is I like to experiment a lot. I think I have a lot of little ideas that wouldn't necessarily sustain like a whole novel, nor should they, but like could be really fun to experiment with in the short story form. And so I do value the form a lot as like a forum for play and experimentation. And then also there is a time reason. Like I have been and continue to work full time. So, sometimes it's just easier to write a short story than to like go chapter after chapter after chapter in a novel. Is the novel a form you're still interested in it? Yes, I am still very much interested in writing novels. I read a lot of novels. And hopefully there will be one for me one day.
I mean, I like the point about it being a place where you can play, because I mean, every story for me is like an experiment, and an experiment that couldn't be sustained for a novel. Like this is an experiment that only can last this many pages. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 12, but it's because the concept and the conceit and just the action, like they can't sustain themselves. they burn fast. They burn very fast. They're a fast burning star. They won't last for the length of the universe. They're gonna be gone before all the other stars. I love that about them. That's the point why, like, it's at some point, like, if you just know, it's like, this can't be anything longer than 10
Yeah.
pages. This can only be 10 pages. It's too much weird stuff going on.
But maybe 10 pages is the perfect, like,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
So I love that thought on it. Ooh, this is a tough question. How did you find out that your novel was quote unquote bad? Was it from constant rejection? Was it from feedback from friends? Was it your own internal critic or your own self standards?
It was definitely myself. Like, actually, no one has read the novel except me. Um, but I worked on it for 5 years, and I got to the end, the first draft, and I was like, I just knew. Sometimes you just know. Like, I was like, I know that my short stories are better. And I read this, I read them, and I was just like, I can't, like, I can't even tell you the plot anymore. I blacked it out from my mind because it was so bad. And like, I just knew in my heart, I was like, this is not the kind of book that I'm proud of. And I don't think that editing it will make it better.
Yeah, that's hard to admit, but I've been there. We've all been there. I've researched a novel for 2 years and started writing it and realized that I couldn't write it. It's like, oh, well, that was 2 years of research, that horribly depressing research that probably caused psychological harm for no product. But never talk about writing as a product. Delete that from your memory. Never call writing a product. That's terrible. So speaking of writing stories, let's talk about collecting stories. How did these stories become a single project? Were you always writing toward a collection, or were you just sort of writing stories and one day you realized you had enough for a collection?
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, I think I started out, I wrote a lot of different short fictions and stuff. And then I was trying to write a novel once I started my graduate program. And while chugging along on that train, on the evenings or like whenever I wanted a break from it, which was often, I would go and write a short story. And there was a huge sense of like, oh, it's so nice to be able to write a short story and get to the end and feel like it's done and like I can just go back and edit it. I don't have to worry about the next like 100 pages it might be. And again, like there was a lot of fun for me, like a lot of play and lightness and being able to like write a short story while like kind of like wrangling with my albatross on the side. And so then the first time I sat down, I was like, oh, I had published a couple short stories, and then I realized I had like somehow accumulated enough for a collection. And then when I sat down, I was like, actually, I think these all have a lot in common, which was a lot of them were about teenager girls. There were a lot of them were about the internet, about escapism, about like the gays, and things like that. And so I did assemble a version of this book in early 2020. Once we were all locked down, I assembled an early version that was called The Girl with the Double Eyelids. And at the time, the title story was The Girl with the Double Eyelids, which is about a high school girl in Nanjing in China who gets double eyelid surgery. And I thought that the theme of the collection at the time was about teenage girlhood and adolescence and kind of like sort of like those years before you're a full adult, before you're legally an adult. But then when I tried to query with that short story collection and didn't get very far, I kind of put it aside, and then I wrote a couple more stories. And the ones that kind of like really shaped the collection were Monitor World and Chicken Film Youth, which are I think they're the first two stories maybe in the collection. And then another major thing that changed was like I wrote a revision of Let's Go, Let's Go, Let's Go, and made it kind of like a lot longer and more detailed than the draft it was. And those three changes really aged up the collection. So I took away some stories that no longer fit, and like it became more of a collection about both like, teenage, but also like young adult women. A lot of it became about escapism. And I feel like putting the title Let's Go, Let's Go, Let's Go on the cover instead of the previous one made me think about it in a different way. It made me think about like the energy of wanting to escape.
It's a really good title for the cover too. It pops off the cover really well. So it's an effective title too. Just another question, because you mentioned the order of the stories, and I was asked, the question always comes up, I feel like, is how did you choose the order? And my incredibly unsatisfactory answer every time I was asked was, I did it. This is the first thing I did, and this is how they stayed. It just felt right. I didn't think about it too hard. I made a mixtape. I just like
Nice.
sitting in my boombox,
Mhm.
circa 1996,
Mhm.
recording tracks to get the right orders on the mixtape. So I was wondering how you approached the organization of the stories within the collection.
The stories, I really did work a lot with my editor at Tin House, Elisa Ogi, for the order. And she actually just like put out like a poets and writers write-up this morning about how she approaches ordering collections. So she and I really went over it a lot. Like it was like, and she is a poet, and I think that I really appreciated that. I feel like she had sort of a different eye for like the flow of energy throughout the stories than maybe someone who was purely just a fiction reader might have. And so one thing that we did do, like when we were looking at the order of the stories, was, so there are two recurring characters. The one that recurs the most is a girl named Luna, and she's in 4 of the stories. And we did think about like, okay, if she's going to be recurring in these stories, what is the most satisfying order for the reader to see her in, so that there's like some kind of character arc. But then another thing we thought about was the first 3 stories, Chicken Film Youth, Monitor World, and Zeros and Ones. I always knew that those 3 were kind of like psychologically like claustrophobic, and those were 3 that I felt like really fit together. So those were always the first 3 stories in the collection. Like we wanted to draw the reader in with a big like with like a bunch of claustrophobic stories in a row, and then like let them breathe with the 4th story. So like we did think about things like building tension and like when to let the reader breathe, and also about the progression of Luna throughout the pages.
That's a really good answer to that question. That's the best answer I think I've ever heard to the arranging of stories question. So that's really great. In the chat window, we have, how much do you draw from your own experiences to create your characters and the situations and the worlds of your stories?
Yeah, I think that inevitably every writer kind of ends up being inspired by the day-to-day life. And while I mean a lot of the things that happen are like, surreal or fantastical, so they're definitely not things that I like actually experience myself. But I think I do go around wondering like, oh, like if I had this ability, for example, one of the girls has this ability to see like she sees like these like kind of like ghostly tattoos on adults around her, and like infers secrets about them through that. Like there's these like symbols that she tries to interpret. I do wonder like, oh, like how would my life be different if I had this like extra dimensional ability to understand people and the world around me? Because again, I feel like I often don't understand, and through my writing, that's what I'm trying to do, like try to understand like why someone is the way they are and why the world is the way they are. And so I do think that I approach the stories a lot with a question in my own life that I'm trying to understand, and that ends up becoming the foundation for the rest of the plot.
Getting close to the end here, so I'm going to ask just what's next for you? You said, I'm not sure that is there anything directly in the works? Is there any dream in terms of, say, a novel in the works, or is there actually something in the works, more stories? Where do you think you might be going in the near future? And so, let's not think about the far future. What's immediately next?
So I actually wrote a ton of poetry the last 2 years, and really worked a lot on improving myself as a poet. And so there's been a lot of poetry publications in magazines and stuff for me the last couple months. So that's been something kind of like interesting, which I wouldn't have expected for me to pursue a couple years ago. So that's one thing. But
Have you
then
committed to Poet Lore, published by the Writer Center?
I just heard about them today.
It's free to submit,
It
pays
sounds great.
$50 per published poem, and it's America's oldest poetry magazine.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think like I've been writing poetry more the last 2 or 3 years, and um, having a lot of like getting a lot out of that, honestly. But since this book has come out, I do feel like kind of like it feels good to like let it go into the world, and I have been kind of like feeling really ready to like go back and write some fiction. Yeah,
Oh, so there is some on the near horizon.
hopefully.
Hopefully, because I'm looking forward to it. I want more greedily myself. All right, it looks like I've gotten through all the questions in the chat window, so I may go to the final question of the evening, which is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a writer just starting out?
Yes. And I got this from an interview with Ruth Ozeki, but I think it's really helpful, which is that only you can write what you write. So don't compare yourself to other people. I think it's normal to look for advice or for a roadmap from maybe an author you admire or like a teacher or a mentor, but ultimately ultimately they write what they write and you are the only person who lives your life and can write what you write. So I would focus on learning about yourself.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. All right, everyone. Well, I believe we've reached the end of the evening. I want to again encourage everyone to get a copy of the book. Let's Go, Let's Go, Let's Go is amazing. Let's all go to the bookstore right away and get it. But really, I've really enjoyed reading it. I love the things it's doing. It's doing things I still don't understand. So it's a book I'm going to be thinking about. If we get back together in a year, we can probably have a whole other conversation about it, because I'll have thought of some new questions about how it's functioning.
I mean, your questions were all so smart and insightful. I really appreciated the close read.
Oh, well, thank you. And thanks everyone for coming out. And please check our website to see what we have coming up. And we'll see you again soon at the Writer's Center virtually. And Cleo, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a
Thank you
pleasure.
so much again for having me.